Thank you all for coming to our talk on asymmetry of grasp in haptic perception. This is work done at Microsoft Research by myself, Mar, Mike Sinclair, and Yellowfek. I want to start talking about human perception, touch in particular, but from a multisensory perspective. In general, we can think of these two concurrent models that are happening in our brain to make sense of the world. The first one is a bottom-up process. It takes all the information, sensory information that we're getting through our sensors, we assemble it, we integrate it, and then we define things like, what am I touching? And then there is this other model that is happening concurrently, which is the top-down processing, and that is based on our prior experience. So you'll basically ask yourself, is this something I've touched before? In that regard, one of the models is based on the idea that if you have enough information, you can do direct perception. Completely direct is a bottom-up perception. If you don't have enough information, then you're going to have to do top-down processing in order to fill the gaps. When we grab an object in reality, we can explore it and pay attention to different physical properties of the object, such as elasticity, and then we can release the object. Okay, so in general, if we are thinking about all the sensory information in the environment, we can think of, as we said, we can have enough information, not enough information, or even too much information. So our brain will also discard information that seems redundant. Therefore, once we have all this sensory information, especially for cases in which there is not enough information, which in haptics is very frequently because it's very hard to simulate every single property of the objects or the hand. We will, of course, based on our prior knowledge of stored in the brain, and then inference our perception. An example of perception inference and top-down processing is this Gaetano Canizza illusion, in which you can clearly, completely see these two triangles, despite they are not drawn completely. And this top-down processing also makes us very error-prone, which means we can trick the brain, right? For example, the Müller-Lyer illusion, which is also quite famous, show that these two lines that are exactly the same size, one seems longer because of how the arrow is positioned. We further explored this idea that we're very error-prone and how to really understand this top-down processing, this direct perception, how much can you have of both of them. And we find that you can have reduced simulation that can make haptics cheaper for consumers. But what happens if, on the contrary, we're getting better haptics, but we cannot deliver perfect haptics? Right, so we found that we can have an uncanny valley of haptics precisely similar to the uncanny valley that you can find in vision, but on haptics. So we do an effect on illusion of a spatial touch with two sensor with two stimulations on each finger, and then people can perceive a ball moving across the empty space between their hands. So they have to rate where they feel the ball, and also later provide information about how realistic they felt the experience was. Okay, and there are several conditions, and we find visualization of the experience is very important for the uncanny valley. So I think after that experience, we run into the idea that for haptic design, maybe we need to have a shift in paradigm from creating better and better direct perception and providing enough information. It might not be enough. We might have to play into the top-down processing, things that are already prior in our brain, and we don't want to break that. So we're gonna try to shift in paradigm. And this is an example of a prior device that we had, which is trying precisely to do this direct perception with enough information, trying to simulate perfectly what it feels to do a grasping.
We use a force center located at the fingertip mount to enable closed-loop force feedback control system with a servo motor. The servo motor only reacts to the forces exerted by the index finger. With the closed-loop force control, we can render variable stiffness. For example, users can grab and feel solid virtual objects, but also soft deformable virtual objects.
So here, it is a very expensive device that requires a servo and everything, but we're kind of figuring, oh, could we do the same and only simulate part of the experience instead of simulating the outward and the inward and the elasticity on both directions? Could we provide just enough information for the haptics to fill the gap during the release of the object, for example? So we prepare another device which is can only render the gripping and not the releasing.
We present the CapstanCrunch, a haptic controller that uses controlled brake technology to render haptic grasp at varying compliance levels, and that can sustain human-scale grasping forces up to 20 newtons. It does so by using capstan-based brake for variable pure resistive forces and a clutchable spring that is capable of outfitting the stored energy of a built-in spring. This duality, capstan brake plus clutched spring, creates a unique device that can go beyond the limitation of a binary brake or a spring and can simulate human scale forces.
So we have an experience here in which we are providing very good gripping and just completely constant releasing.
We present.
We run an experiment based on Hooke's law. We have 6 balls of different elasticity, from completely rigid to very squishy, and we ask people to, for 5 seconds, pinch and release the ball to feel the compliance. We have 12 participants, so we will have 2 types of devices. The first one that was symmetric can simulate both the inward elasticity and the outward elasticity. And the second one, which is asymmetric, which is the CapstanCrunch. For every ball people play with, we ask them this question from 1 to 7, how realistic was the grasp of the ball. The results show that the level of realism is pretty high in both devices. Even the direct simulation, the symmetric device, had complex, it did have a hard time to render the very squishy objects, partially because with the servo motor, it has a limit of how fast can you go, and you need a very expensive servo motor to be able to do this correctly. So there were no significant difference between the 2 devices anyway, and we tested for equivalence, and they were significantly equivalent. We added an additional placebo haptic, which was a constant spring. You can see it here on the right, and that meant that it was only a visual experience and the haptic was always constant. For the values near the constant K, the realism scored pretty high. For values outside of the constant, there was a significant difference with the other devices. So it is the asymmetry of the grasp means that you really need to deliver some sort of information on the grasping at least, but not so much on the releasing, or you don't need the releasing information so much, and then it performs very nicely. So we have this duality, right? The asymmetry, it means that the inward grip is an area and moment in which the humans are being very exploratory. They're paying a lot of attention to the object and the physical properties. And once there is this enough understanding, we ignore the signals, so we're able to focus on the next experience. Whereas on the outward release, when we're releasing, by the time that we're releasing the objects, we undergo an attention reduction and also all these top-down predictions start playing. So even if the actual sensory input doesn't completely correspond to the prediction can override. Thank you all for watching the asymmetry of grasp, and I'm ready for questions.